based on the availability of testing? When do you see that happening?
You know, Jake, that's a great question. And that's really what I was inferring when I said a rolling reentry. It is not going to be a light switch that we say, okay, it is now June, July, or whatever, click, the light switch goes back on. It's going to be depending where you are in the country, the nature of the outbreak that you've already experienced, and the threat of an outbreak that you may not have experienced. So it's going to having to look at the situation in different parts of the country. Obviously, New York, who went and is going through a terrible ordeal, is going to be very different from Arkansas, and you'll hear from the governor shortly, and very different maybe from some places on the West Coast, like Washington State, which have been successfully able to prevent that big spike. I think it's going to have to be something that is not one size fits all.
When do you think it could start?
You know, I think it could probably start, at least in some ways, maybe next month. And again, Jake, it's so difficult to make those kinds of predictions because they always get thrown back at you if it doesn't happen. Not by you, but, you know, by any of a number of people. We are hoping that at the end of the month, we could look around and say, okay, is there any element here that we can safely and cautiously start pulling back on? If so, do it. If not, then just continue to hunker down. And that's what, at least from the standpoint of the public health aspect, that we look at. Other decisions are going to have to be made at the level of the president and the governors about what they are going to do with all of the information they get. The only thing I and my colleagues in public health and medicine can do is to give a projection of the kinds of things that may or may not happen when you make these steps.
And I know you're concerned about the idea of what happens if it happens too quickly, prematurely, and then precipitously the U.S. or that area of the U.S. goes back to a dire situation. The University of Washington professor Chris Murray, who I know you're familiar with his work, he runs the model frequently cited by your task force. He told CNN that he is worried that if the country opens up too soon, quote, the risk of rebound is very great. And according to his model, when it comes to stay-at-home and social and physical distancing measures, quote, if we were to stop at the national level by May 1st, we are seeing a return to almost where we are now sometime in July. Do you agree with him? And what happens if parts of the country try to go back to some semblance of normal, but the testing and contact tracing capacity is not there?
Well, I mean, Chris is a very good modeler, and we relied on him heavily to give us some capability of making some projections. But I believe what they were referring to in that model, Jake, and it's important, is I agree. That's why I said a few moments ago, if you just say, okay, it's whatever, you know, May 1st, click, turn the switch on. Obviously, if you do it in an all or none way, there's an extraordinary risk of there being a rebound. So in that respect, that model is correct. And that's why I mean it is not an all or none. It's going to be something that you gradually and carefully, in different parts of the country, in different ways, try to get back. I totally agree if that all of a sudden we decide, okay, it's May whatever, and we just turn the switch on, that could be a real problem. And everybody knows that. So it's going to be something different from that. It's going to be a concerted way to take a look and try doing it appropriately, depending upon where you are in the country and what the nature of the outbreak is in that part of the country. And I'm sure you'll hear the same thing from the governors.
South Korea and the U.S. announced their first confirmed coronavirus cases at virtually the same time in late January. If you take a look at where we are right now in the U.S. now has 50 times more cases and almost 100 times more fatalities than South Korea. Meanwhile, while the U.S. makes up only about 4.25% of the world's population, the U.S. has 30% of the world's reported coronavirus cases and almost 20% of the reported coronavirus deaths. Sanjay Gupta said this is all because we got started too late in the U.S. Is that right? Do you agree?
You know, it isn't as simple as that, Jake. I'm sorry. I mean, to just say this is all happening because we got started too late. Obviously, if you look, could you have done something a little bit earlier? Would have had an impact, obviously. But where we are right now is the result of a number of factors. The size of the country, the heterogeneity of the country. I think it's a little bit unfair to compare us to South Korea, where they had an outbreak in Daegu and they had the capability of immediately, essentially, shutting it off completely in a way that we may not have been able to do in this country. So obviously, I would have been nice if we had a better head start, but I don't think you could say that we are where we are right now because of one factor. It's very complicated, Jake.
The New York Times reported yesterday that you and other top officials wanted to recommend social and physical distancing guidelines to President Trump as far back as the third week of February. But the administration didn't announce such guidelines to the American public until March 16th, almost a month later. Why?
You know, Jake, as I've said many times, we look at it from a pure health standpoint. We make a recommendation. Often the recommendation is taken. Sometimes it's not. But it is what it is. We are where we are right now.
Do you think lives could have been saved if social distancing, physical distancing, stay-at-home measures had started third week of February instead of mid-March?
You know, Jake, again, it's the what would have, what could have. It's very difficult to go back and say that. I mean, obviously, you could logically say that if you had a process that was ongoing and you started mitigation earlier, you could have saved lives. Obviously, no one is going to deny that. But what goes into those kinds of decisions is complicated. But you're right. I mean, obviously, if we had, right from the very beginning, shut everything down, it may have been a little bit different. But there was a lot of pushback about shutting things down back then.
Do you think it will be safe in November for voters to physically go to vote at the polls?
I hope so, Jake. I can't guarantee it. I believe that if we have a good, measured way of rolling into this steps towards normality, that we hope by the time we get to November that we'll be able to do it in a way which is the standard way. However, and I don't want to be the pessimistic person, there is always a possibility as we get into next fall and the beginning of early winter, that we could see a rebound. And hopefully, what we've gone through now and the capability that we have for much, much better testing capability, much, much better surveillance capability, and the ability to respond with countermeasures, with drugs that work, that it will be an entirely different ballgame. So number one, I hope we don't have a rebound that would make this very difficult as we get into November. But if we do, and there certainly is a possibility, I'm a realist, it certainly is a possibility, hopefully we'll be able to respond to that rebound in a much more effective way than what we're seeing now in January, February, March.
You're a man of medicine, a man of science, but today's Easter Sunday, and I know that your Catholic faith and your Jesuit education